This presentation is training for the JRDA sudden scoring and injury call-off procedures. Created and presented by Officially Mel. Hello, I'm Officially Mel, WFTDA Certified Level 2 Non-Skating Official and the JRDA Stats Committee Chair. Before we get started, I have a quick disclaimer. All information in this presentation is not endorsed by any other organization. In order to remain consistent with the information provided by the WFTA or JRDA, some text and examples have been pulled directly from the WFTA or JRDA documents. However, no organization, including but not limited to the WFTA or JRDA, is responsible for the content or accuracy of the content in this presentation. The information presented here is current as of December 31st, 2023, and all opinions are strictly my own. Let's first talk about why the JRDA is different than the WFTDA. Their mission is to nurture bold self-confidence in youth by developing teamwork and athletic ability while treasuring individuality within a culture of integration, encouragement, and service to others. It is important to keep in mind their mission for the purposes of the differences in the JRDA rules and guidelines. That said, the JRDA rules are plentiful. There are 27 rules pages, 51-page casebook, a 6-page glossary, JRDA Statsbook, the JRDA specific Statsbook manual, the Jersey policy, the JRDA sanctioning policy, the pre-game protocol, the JRDA code of conduct, the risk management guidelines, officiating procedures and staffing guidelines, an alternative regulation track guideline, and that's not all. That's a lot of information. It's my hope that presentations like this will help to break down some of the differences so that the information is easier to understand. In this seminar, we're going to go through track options, which include full track or alternative track layouts, sudden scoring and what to do and how to notate it when it happens, injury call-off and what to do and how to notate it when it happens, and point out how to find a couple of these key resources. We'll start out with an easy one, track options notation. The JRDA has two different track layout options, a standard one, like the one you use for the WFTA, and then the alternative track layout. The alternative track is about 5 feet shorter on the straightaways and can be played on a high school regulation basketball court size area, 84 feet by 50 feet. Paperwork notation that addresses track options is super simple. The JRDA has provided a drop-down in Section 1 to select full or alt. Alt is for alternative track. Now we're going to talk about sudden scoring, another JRDA specific process. While the JRDA does not rank leagues the same way as the WFTA, and there is no advantage to a complete blowout of unevenly matched teams, the JRDA develops sudden scoring as a way to minimize the score differential in those situations. Tracking this is a little more complicated than a drop-down, but there is a clear process. The sudden scoring description can be found on the JRDA website in the JRDA Rules document, Appendix 1. Additional details can be found in the JRDA Officiating Procedures and Staffing Guidelines under the Officials Resources on the JRDA website. For the purposes of discussing sudden scoring effects on paperwork, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what triggers sudden scoring. At the halftime of a game, the head referee and head NSO will confirm the score. The sudden scoring procedure is triggered if the following policy criteria are met at halftime. The score differential of the game is 150 points or more, and the trailing team has 25 or fewer points. If the criteria have not been met, the second period will be played as usual. For example, if Team Blue has 25 points and Team Red has 175 points, it qualifies. However, if Team Blue has 26 points and Team Red has 175 points, it doesn't. If the procedure is triggered, the head referee and head NSO will conference with the coaches of both teams and inform them that sudden scoring will be in effect for the second period. Sudden scoring, while in effect for the second period, will result in jams being played as standard jams, with 3 exceptions. There is no lead jammer. Both jammers begin scoring on the first trip, and jams may last up to 1 minute. All other gameplay remains unchanged, including the length of time between jams. Teams retain the same number of timeouts and official reviews for the second half, as they otherwise would have, and those timeouts and official reviews will work the same way. In the event the second period of a game for which the sudden scoring rule is triggered ends in a tie score, standard overtime procedures will be used. Sudden scoring affects 3 of the NSO positions. The scoreboard operator first needs to make sure the scoreboard is set up for JRDA play at the start of the game. Then they select the sudden scoring button for the second half if it applies. All the rest of the adjustments for the scoreboard are built into the CRG. The scorekeeper will confirm the score with the head ref and the head NSO. They will then continue paperwork for period 2 with modifications that we will discuss in a bit. The jam timer is primarily responsible for calling off jams for sudden scoring period 2, except in the case of injury. The head NSO has something to do as well. During halftime, once it's determined that sudden scoring is in effect for period 2, the head NSO will draw a circle around the yes in the IGRF section asking if sudden scoring was triggered. Now let's discuss the paperwork affected by sudden scoring. In the scorekeeping paperwork, you will not mark lead, lost, call, or no initial call-ups. In most cases, it will be the jam timer who will call off the jam after the 1-minute jam end, except in the case of injury. The JRDA injury call-off procedure will not apply for the period 2 sudden scoring process, since there is no lead jammer. Even though the first pass for period 2 when sudden scoring is triggered counts as a scoring pass, you do not record points for trip 2 as you do for an overtime jam. 2 is essentially both the initial and a scoring trip, as if the initial has already been completed. Now we're going to talk about what happens during an injury call-off and how it affects the Statsbook paperwork. The injury call-off description can be found on the JRDA website in the JRDA Rules document, Appendix 2. Additional details can be found in the JRDA Officiating Procedures and Staffing Guidelines under the Officials Resources on the JRDA website. For the purposes of discussing how injury call-offs affect paperwork, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what an injury call-off is. This procedure is triggered when a jam is called off by the officials due to a player's injury when the following criteria are met. The player's injury was not the result of penalized contact. The opposing team of the injured player had active lead jammer status at the time of the call-off, and the same jam was not resumed via this policy already. If the injury call-off meets the criteria, it should be shared with both teams that the team with the lead has the option to apply the injury call-off procedure or decline using it. If the 3 criteria are not met, the jam is considered complete and this procedure is not implemented. When the 3 policy criteria are met, then the jam will be resumed from the point at which the jam was called off. A jam may only be stopped and resumed once. If a resumed jam is again called off, such that the first 2 policy criteria are met, the jam is considered complete. To resume a jam, the following procedure will be implemented. Teams will line up as if it were a new jam with the same blockers and jammers in their appropriate pre-jam positions prior to the injury. No substitutions will be permitted with the exception of the skater that was injured prior to the call-off. The lead jammer for the called-off jam will start the resumed jam as lead jammer. The time remaining on the jam clock will be the maximum amount of time for the resumed jam. For example, officials stop the jam after 1 minute and 15 seconds of the jam has elapsed. With the maximum length of a jam being 2 minutes, the resumed jam will elapse a maximum of 45 seconds. The lead jammer can still call it off earlier if desired. Another part of the injury call-off procedure is if a jammer is on their initial trip, they will begin the resumed jam also on their initial trip. If a jammer is on a scoring trip, the current scoring trip is ended and the earned passes are reported. They begin the resumed jam on the next scoring trip. The officiating process for starting the jam and all other gameplay remains unchanged. Now let's talk about my favorite part, paperwork notation. First, we'll talk about scorekeeping paperwork. First thing to note for injury call-off is something we do anyway. Mark with an X on the original row for the jam for both teams if the jam is called off for injury before the natural end of the jam. This applies to any injury that happens, no matter what position the injured person is playing, what team they are on, and includes jams called for injured officials. In the jam column where you put the jam number, for the resumed jam following injury call-off, both scorekeepers move down to the next line and write INJ in the jam column. For the team that did not have a skater's injury result in the jam being paused, add an asterisk to the jam column. It should read INJ asterisk. The jammer for both teams will be the same unless the injury is to the non-lead team's jammer, in which case you will enter in the number of the substitute jammer for the non-lead team. As we discussed in an earlier example, in any of the trip columns when a jam is paused for injury and meets the criteria to be resumed, the jammer's points for the trip they were on when the jam was paused should be recorded. When the jam is resumed, both scorekeepers move to the next line and resume tracking points under the next trip. This is the same for both teams, whether they were the lead team or had the injured skater. For example, if red team was on trip 3 and had not scored points at the time the jam was called for injury, then you would enter a 0. At the resumed jam, you would then record any additional points in the trip 4 column. If the jammer has not completed their initial trip when the jam is paused, mark the NI column with an X. If the jammer does not complete their initial trip by the end of the jam, mark this column with an X on the INJ line. As usual, do not enter a score for the trip 2 column if the skater has not completed the initial pass. For the lead column, for lead jammer in the INJ asterisk row, the lead jammer gets a repeat marking in the lead column, and if applicable, at the end of the jam, a call marking. If there is a second injury for the jam after the jam has been resumed, the jam is considered complete. For lineup paperwork, you will mark injuries just as you do for any other game by entering a 3 in the injured skater's box column of the lineup's paperwork. In the jam number column, for a resumed jam for the team whose skater's injury resulted in the jam being paused, move down to the next line and write INJ in the jam column and start tracking the rest of the resumed jam on the new INJ line. In the pivot and blockers column, this is similar to when tracking a star pass. You transfer all the same skaters into the INJ line. The only variation is the substitution for the injured skater. Lead team in the INJ asterisk row, enter the jammer's number. The rest of the INJ asterisk row will be blank. You will note any new or continued penalties for the jammer, pivot, and blockers for the lead team in the original row. Notation for a second injury within an injury call-up line is the same for any injury. Mark the injured skater's box column with a 3. Note, if the second injury is for the lead team, the notation goes in the original jam's line unless it's for the team's lead jammer, in which case it will be noted in the INJ asterisk line, or a combination of a star pass and an injury call-off. It looks more complicated than it is. For an injury call-off that happens alongside a star pass, whether the star pass happens before or after the injury call-off, you will treat them separately according to the standard processes. Each team will have the same number of lines on the lineup paperwork, and no data will be listed on the line for SP asterisk. All penalties for the lead team should be listed in the original row. We will now learn where to find the JRDA track layout, the current JRDA Statsbook, and the JRDA Statsbook manual. To find the track layout guide, visit the JRDA website, Games Navigation tab, Rules tab, and scroll down until you find the JRDA Alternative Regulation Track Layout Guide. To find the JRDA specific Statsbook, visit the JRDA website, Games Navigation tab, Score and Stats Reporting tab, and scroll to download the JRDA specific Statsbook. You will also find the link to the JRDA specific Statsbook manual on the same page. In summary, in this presentation, we discussed the full track and the alternative track layouts. We learned what to do and how to notate sudden scoring. We learned what to do and how to notate an injury call-off. And we learned where you can find the resources describing the processes. Thanks for watching. Looking for more videos? You can find more roller derby videos on my YouTube channel at Mel's Guide to Roller Derby. Hope to see you on the track soon.